Welcome to State of Mind. This is Julian Royce. Thank you so much for tuning in. I am just getting back from Burning Man, and wow, what an intense experience that is. I'll share a bit more about that in a moment, but first I want to say that this is a great episode. Today I'm speaking with the inspiring Dr. Shannon Hughes, and she helped found something called the NOAC Society. I'll talk more about that too, but I want to let everyone here know that there is an upcoming event called the Emergence Festival. It's happening October 1st in Denver, and it's a psychedelic education festival. And there's a link in the show notes below to learn more about it. But in November, people in this great state of Colorado will get to vote on decriminalizing psilocybin mushrooms and legalizing their supported use. And so this Emergence Education Festival is a great way to learn more about these ballot initiatives and just to learn about all things psychedelic. It is a celebration of how strong our communities of psychedelic educators and practitioners and advocates are. It features DJs, food trucks, face painting, Q&As with various experts, and a State of Mind podcast will be a part of it, which I'm super excited about. Now, unfortunately, I'm not going to get to be there in person. I will be in North Carolina celebrating my mother's 70th birthday. Love you, Mom. However, I have a great team of people that's going to go down. Shout out to Mayor and Rumsey and everyone else involved. And they're going to set up a station for a State of Mind podcast, and we're going to set up this huge space-age looking tent called a shift pod, which is all silvery and reflective. And inside we're going to have a mobile recording station. And we're going to be asking participants, people who want to participate in this, to share about their own experiences, their own insights, healings, transformations, and just stories related to psychedelics. And then I will then edit these, the best of these, into an upcoming episode. And so the inspiration for this comes from Rick Doblin, who's the founder of this organization called MAPS, which stands for the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Science or Studies. And MAPS has really been the single biggest organization behind this movement to legalize and legitimize psychedelic medicines. And Rick Doblin has been a tireless champion for these causes for, gosh, I think since the 80s. And so Rick Doblin was asked, what can the average person do to help support this movement? And he said, they can come out of the closet, you can out yourself, you can talk about yourself as someone who has used and benefited from psychedelic medicine, and that will help to normalize it and help this legalization movement to really happen in a profound and meaningful way. And so that is the inspiration for this State of Mind project at the Emergence Festival, again, happening October 1st from 12 noon to 5 p.m. Come on down to Denver. Check out the link in the show notes below to learn more. So, back to Burning Man. It is difficult to find words for this, right? And so as I've gotten back, I've noticed people saying, hey, how are you doing? And how is Burning Man? ? And it's like, often asked in this quick way. They just want to hear good or something. Like they don't want the real answer. So I've been answering. It was a lot. It was an intense experience because that feels true. And it, included great experiences, good times, and challenging times. It's a very challenging environment to live in. The desert there is very intense. At one point I was in this epic dust storm, which was literally a complete whiteout. I couldn't see 5 feet in front of me. And I was with just one other friend, and it was at the night, and we were in the middle of the playa, or the desert there. And unfortunately, the dust got, into my eyes a little bit, into their eyes, and so we were literally walking blind through the desert. And maybe this is a story for another time, but luckily we both survived, and I'm grateful for the experience overall. Really glad I went. And just to share with you here now, a real highlight of the whole time for me was I got to give a workshop, but another real highlight for me was giving a talk. So I gave a talk on psychedelics, therapy, and Buddhism. It was held in this beautiful tent with a lot of squish and softness for people to sit on. And the questions I got at the end during the Q&A were actually really good. Turns out there was a professor of philosophy in the audience. There were a bunch of other therapists and healers and people engaged in this space. And so I am planning to refine this talk and present it again here in Boulder and record it. And I may share it here on the podcast stream, but I'll at least share it on my YouTube channel. So look out for that in the next few weeks. I'm excited to be doing that. Okay, for today's episode, I'm speaking with the lovely Dr. Shannon Hughes, who, as I said, is a founding member of the NOAC Society. And the NOAC Society is a nonprofit whose mission is to connect and organize psychedelic communities and give voice to the essential values and pressing issues of the psychedelic movement. And if I didn't say it before, they are the ones sponsoring and creating this Emergence Festival, which again is a really cool event. I'm really excited about it. Dr. Shannon Hughes is someone who teaches, writes, and conducts research about the medicalization of human distress and the role of psychotropic drugs in managing our mental and emotional lives. She's passionate about supporting grassroots movements that help us reclaim our individual power from external bodies and corporations which seek to have us living outside of ourselves for their own profit or benefit. It is time to reclaim the use of medicine and to connect with our inner sources of intelligence. And so I really appreciate her positive activism in this regard. As we discussed in our conversation, there's a real risk that with the mainstreaming and legalization movement of psychedelic medicines, there's this risk of them being co-opted by the medical and pharmaceutical companies and kind of medical establishment. And she's really advocating in a powerful way for everyone to have equal access to these. And she's also been engaged in some really exciting research, including a study on the use of MDMA among couples for relationship enhancement, and another research project around underground psilocybin guides here in Colorado. And it was really cool to get to read those, and we talk about those in our conversation here. So, without further ado, I bring you the great, the powerful Dr. Shannon Hughes. And I'm here today with Shannon Hughes. Shannon, thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, and would you like to just introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I'm Shannon, she, her pronouns. I'm an associate professor in the School of Social Work at Colorado State University here in Fort Collins, where I live. And also do have my hands in a lot of different pots. So we maintain a private practice. My partner does therapy. I do some spiritual coaching, and we do some workshops and trainings and different things out of that practice. And then also do some community education and community organizing through the nonprofit, the NOAC Society.
Beautiful. Yeah, that's great. Real quick at the beginning here, do you want to speak to social work? I work as a therapist and have a degree in counseling psychology. And it seems like social work is its own, it's its own field, but very related.
Yeah, to like counseling and social work. And so I counsel students a lot who are trying to figure out if they're, what direction they're going to go in their career path, counseling or social work or some other route. And I think that social work, what distinguishes social work is its social justice perspective. We have a like systems level thinking where we're supposed to be looking at client problems and client system problems through the lens of like the micro, the meso, the macro, and bringing some like social justice orientation to the work that we do, acknowledging the, effects of systemic oppression and racism and all of these things on the client systems that we work with, and advocating for change within the systems that we work within. So while most social workers are like agency-based practitioners, even within an agency, social workers are supposed to be using like that systems perspective and the social justice lens and advocating for organizational change when there is like injustice like happening with it at the organizational level. So it's a little different. Like social workers, we don't get as much of like the actual like clinical counseling skills in our social work practice, but we get a lot of the anti-oppressive work. A lot of our curriculum is around anti-oppressive practice and disrupting various forms of social, economic, and environmental injustice.
Interesting. Okay. So it's a consciously more explicitly activist field, so to speak. Is that fair?
Yes. Okay. Yes, it is supposed to be. Although there's, tensions in the profession, over the years on, what is social work and the identity of professionals and what are we supposed to be doing? Because of course, there's been time periods where social work was sort of co-opted by the, establishment, the Western medical establishment, and sort of just the helpers to physicians or other like medical professionals, or, within agencies and systems dominated by medical professionals, and social workers were sort of like, in these like helping roles. And so there's been a lot of tension back and forth between like, what is our purpose? Like, what are we actually supposed to be doing? And how do we actually disrupt these systems of oppression? And at what level do we intervene, individual, community, policy? So social workers are supposed to be thinking at all of these different levels and intervening in their practice in all of those ways.
That's interesting. Yeah, I've noticed I've gotten an increasing number of inquiries of people interested in kind of doing the kind of work I'm doing, being a therapist, being involved with psychedelic assisted therapy. And it seems to me like a degree in social work, licensed clinical social worker, you can do basically what most psychotherapists do if maybe you need some additional trainings, but it seems like opens up a lot of doors.
Yeah, and that's what I tell students too. It really does open up a lot more doors. You can do a lot of the same things. You might need some additional, clinical hours and supervision to like get those skills that you're not going to get in our social work classes. But you have these like additional lenses, and the MSW degree and the LCSW license are like just like really broadly applicable. You can like get into a lot of different roles, not just counseling and therapy, but also counseling and therapy, but also other things too, as a social worker.
Cool. And so, yeah, we're talking today partly because of your work with the NOAC Society. Do you want to speak to that, what that is and what that's about?
Sure. Yeah, the NOAC Society is a Colorado-based nonprofit. I'm one of the co-founders. There is a whole group of us who co-founded the NOAC Society. Oh, I don't know, probably 2017, something like that. So like 5 years ago. And it's been very grassroots and organic. And, the purpose, the mission is just to give voice to the pressing issues and the important values of the psychedelic movement, and especially to build strong communities and professional communities around psychedelics. But not just so that professionals can own this, but so that professionals, all of us, can be sensitized to like, well, what is our appropriate role in this, and how do we practice within psychedelics with, integrity and social justice sensitivities, and without doing harm, and just recognizing that there's multiple pathways into this work. So I think professionals need to have a lot of humility. Medical professionals, licensed professionals, just need to have a lot of humility around, who gets to own this and who should have access to it. And when we're advocating in the policy arena, keeping that in mind, that it's easy to default to say like, oh, well, medical professionals and therapists should own this, and they should be the gatekeepers. But history might suggest otherwise. So if we care about equity and justice and these other principles. So NOAC Society was formed as a way to kind of like brings voice outside of just like the underground scene or like the festival scene, which a lot of us were a part of in different ways. Yeah. For example, doing peer support work at festivals, and really bring it to a more mainstream, like professional audience, in a way that really holds a lot of the integrity of the values of the movement at a grassroots level. And can help create strong communities that can advocate and have voice right here in our backyard about where this goes over the next however many years.
Yeah, it's great. It's a great organization and really great intentions with it. And it's interesting you mentioned festivals. I think music festivals, transformational festivals, have been these kind of microcosmic little cultural experiments where people come together and effectively create a kind of different culture, one in which there's a lot more freedom around things like psychedelics and the substances you choose to take. And I think that's having this like ripple effect out into the world,
Oh yeah, definitely. The festival scene, Burning Man, obviously like the big one, but like I don't know if burners would say Burning Man is a festival. They would say it's like a lifestyle or whatever. I've only been once, but all the other festivals too. Yeah, no, there's just like this great like tolerance for our humanity and for sort of extreme states at festivals. There's for authenticity, for individual expression, for community and connection. There's like these microcosms of community expressing just these different values at festivals and finding the limits of like how do you know your limits is like you cross them and you see limits, with psychoactive drug use for sure being crossed all the time at festivals, and how the community holds it and how they can practice like harm reduction principles to like make space for those like extremes and for, going too far with it. And so it's really an inspirational place to be like grounded in that festival scene. And then to take, the what's learned there and practices there into the more mainstream, bring that to professionals and, break some of the stigma and shame and normalize drug use and normalize extremes of behavior and increase our own tolerance and like mainstream society to be able to, I don't know, honor the diversity of our humanity.
Yeah, yeah. Just to be transparent, I've been to Burning Man 3 times now, and planning to go back this summer. Knock on wood. Hopefully, it works out. But one thing that I got from that experience, from getting to be there, which I consider a privilege, and it was amazing. But just I don't know the numbers exactly, 70 or 80,000 people coming together, creating this community, and how much cooperation, collaboration, and peace there was there. Like, we tend to think that without our laws and all the rules and restrictions we have, things would fall apart, or there'd be chaos, or there'd be anarchy. And to me, that kind of proves that that doesn't have to be that way, that, there's other
Yeah.
possibilities to organize ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah. I know. I've been reading Entangled Life. Have you read Entangled Life?
Uh-uh.
It's a book about fungi, but along this for similar principles, right? Like culturally, we have this idea of like competition being
Right.
natural. Yeah, and like just are these principles of evolution, and it's like only the strong survive, and we're competing for resources, and everything is, and so there's all these examples of like symbiotic relationships in nature and like interdependence, and how life forms that couldn't survive on their own like come together and create these like new life forms, and these like just things that we just like do not at all understand, the complexity and like how that happens. But it shows that perhaps there's much more symbiosis and interdependence in the natural world than we've sort of been led to believe and culturally sort of accepted.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's such an important topic. And I think that evolution is a hugely important topic. And I think we're actually conditioned from a young age around competition, and to see the world as this competition with winners and losers, and, a few people at the top. And the reality is, what has helped humanity, human beings, to have the place we have on this earth is how we cooperate, right? We work together. And so, there
Yeah.
is some competition, but I think the bigger story of evolution is actually cooperation and finding your place within the ecosystem and the balance of everything.
Yeah. And I always try to think about what that means for my own life, because I'm such a high achiever and I have,
Mm.
a hold to these like standards of like productivity and success that have been ingrained in me. And it's like, it's hard to shake it. It's almost like this machine
Mm.
that you're just sort of compelled to, I don't know, create and produce within. And it's hard to like shake that or get outside of that, even when you know better, when everything tells you that that's not necessarily the nature of life, and that's not where you're going to find happiness and all of ultimate success, all of the things. And yet it's really hard to get outside of that. And yeah, this is something I've been thinking about for many years, and I'm still like
Mm.
in that wheel of like productivity and
Yeah.
achievement.
Yeah. I can relate to that too. Yeah. I think hopefully we can create a new culture that really honors, just being, that honors different gifts that people have, that aren't all about numbers and productivity and money and things like that. But the reality is our society appreciates that stuff. And so we don't get a lot of positive feedback if we're not in the hamster wheel churning all the time.
Yeah, and I think that also feeds over into our relationship with drugs. And so as a researcher at CSU, I've been studying just how we use psychoactive substances in mental health, and all the different macro level influences that shape how our relationships with drugs, especially psychiatric, like mental health medications, pharmaceutical industry influence, professional sort of territory and domain over, who has access to what drugs and why. And so that's the kind of stuff I've been doing as a researcher. And yeah. And so even with like drugs, we have this, it's also driven by the cultural demands for like quick fixes. And like, there's a lot of suffering in the world, and we don't have a lot of tolerance or ability to like really grapple socially as a society with like the hard entrenched problems of like our world. We just like don't have the attention span for it. We don't have the sort of endurance for it. And so we're just looking for band-aids a lot of the time. And I think that's what's shaped a lot of our mental health system as we know it, and the paradigm of how we use drugs for mental health. So I'm hopeful that, psychedelic assisted therapies and psychedelic journey work, even outside of the therapeutic context, could hold promise for just, transforming the relationship with all of that, with ourselves, with each other, with our community, with nature, with all of that. However, at the same time, I don't know, there's still a search for just like relief. I just want my suffering to be gone. And if I do this mushroom journey, or maybe if I do this ketamine session, I'll just like be forever changed and I won't suffer anymore. In our private practice, we don't do anything underground. We offer ketamine assisted therapy, but we get calls all the time for ketamine, for MDMA, for psilocybin. And oftentimes it's so many people like coming through like, oh, I'm coming in from Massachusetts next week, and I'm wondering if I could schedule a psilocybin session on Saturday or something like that. And that'll cure me of my depression. And so I don't know, I'm still like, I'm still unsure about like what direction this psychedelic movement is even going to take us.
Yeah, it's a great question. And you raised a lot of great points right there. And one is like the search for a magic bullet is what I call that, right? Like,
The Magic Bullet. There's a good book. It's like 10 years old or more now, but Bob Whitaker, Anatomy of an Epidemic.
Yeah. I'm familiar with that book. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great book. It's one that I assigned for some of my courses, even though it's a decade old now. It's just a really good sort of expose on just the magic bullet. Where did we even come up with this idea of a magic bullet? It was kind of sold to us in some ways also. And then the science behind it for psychiatric medications. And it's a really interesting read.
Yeah, the Anatomy of an Epidemic. I'll link that in the show notes. It's fascinating. I think one of the things you're touching on is our capitalistic culture and the way we sell things. And it seems inevitable that psychedelics, it's already happening. They're going to be advertised. They're going to be sold to people. They're going to be,
and they're going to be commodified, right? They'll be commodified and then treated like any other commodity in, within our economic and social structure. Like they're just sort of be co-opted into that, which really will probably reduce their ability to transform it. Right. Once you're sort of co-opted into the system, it's much less likely that you're going to transform that system or disrupt that system.
Yeah. And it made me think that part of what is being sold is here's how you're supposed to be and here's how life is supposed to be. And that's not you. And the reality is it's probably not anyone. But so here's a pill or a treatment or something that will fix it or make you better. And yeah. And then you've got all the Buddhas behind you. I have a background with Buddhism and Buddhist studies, and the first noble truth is suffering. Life contains suffering or includes suffering, and to make peace with that, to recognize that, to work with that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, in our private practice, my partner and I both come from, very existential orientation, and just these like truths, these very deep truths of life, that we die,
Hmm.
that the nature of suffering, that change is the only constant, impermanence, like all of all of these things, and I think those are I think those are the existential truths that culturally we just do not do we just can't grasp, and we have no room culturally to really like deal with our existential pain of our mortality, of the truth of just like loss and grief and change and endings and beginnings, and all of those things. And so I mean, I think it's just my practice definitely has a spiritual bent. It's very spiritually grounded, and that's just part of my own. I feel like that disconnection with ourselves, within our own inner guidance, with our own intuition, with our own sense of like authentic creative power in the world, and like what is it that wants to flow through us, and what is it that is like mine to give and receive and express in the world. Like that disconnection from that, and our disconnection from anything, the intangible, aspects of the world, whether that's just a purpose or meaning or a sense of connection with nature or whatever. I think those are just that core disconnection from ourselves and each other and the world is like a major contributor to all of the things that we call DSM diagnoses, and all of the different levels of distress that we experience. So that is definitely kind of the grounding for our therapeutic work, is to like help bring people back to their own, that sense of connection within themselves.
Yeah, that was well said. Yeah, it
Thanks.
makes me in my own work, when I work with someone, I sometimes will help someone differentiate an existential truth, like as kind of more, impermanence or death, like that we all die, that things change, versus like the specifics of their particular life that might not be serving them, or that might be leading to suffering that they could shift or get or change or not have to live with. But
Yeah.
so
Yeah. That's well said too. Yep.
well, so you have done some really cool research. I wanted to ask you about that. And you have a PhD, is it? You
Mhm.
can't get a PhD in social work, can you? What's your PhD
Yep.
in?
No, there's
What is
PhDs in social
I
work.
didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah.
Should I- Never mind. So you have a PhD in social work, and your studies were like, one was around the psilocybin, underground psilocybin practitioners.
Yeah, one of the more recent studies, it's a kind of, it's a partnership with some community members. I like doing community involved and community centered research that has like real world implications and real world impact. I don't particularly like research for researchers, or there's a lot of noise in the scientific literature,
Hmm.
and it's just a lot of just dumb stuff that nobody will read, that nobody has access to, because you have to have subscriptions to journals, and they're just like analyses of data and whatever.
And
That's not the type of research I'm into.
is part of the reason for that the kind of publish or perish pressure for academics to just churn out paper after paper?
That is part of it. I mean, there's so many problems with that. Yes, that is definitely a big part of it. And the bar is sort of raised every year on like the sort of publication productivity standards. And it doesn't really matter. You need to have publications out. You're supposed to be producing original research, which makes it, good science is based on replication, right? You want to replicate findings. And that doesn't happen very much anymore, because there's this drive to produce original research. So we're not doing replication studies. And so there's just a gajillion studies with like one sample that had, one finding, and then, the media picks up on it and blows it up as if like, this is the latest discovery and we know this to be true. And I was like, well, I don't know. That was like 50 people. There's some limitations there.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. Let's replicate it. But those replications almost are never done. And then it's too late because it's already been picked up. If it is, something, whatever that would be provocative or significant. And so there's just like a lot of noise, and it's hard to even know what really is true. And what we can count on, what we can really rely on, even scientifically. So anyway, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a little digression, but I like to do community involved research. And so the psilocybin study is with some folks in Colorado, actually through the NOAC Society. And we partnered with, we've got a team of like 6 or 8 people on this research study. And basically we're been interviewing so-called underground or just community practitioners who work with psilocybin, who guide psilocybin sessions for any reason. It could be therapeutic, spiritual, ceremonial, recreational. And we're interviewing them about their background and training, their, practices, the impacts they're seeing with psilocybin, their preferences and concerns about, regulation and, what that could look like. And so, that's been we haven't published it yet. So we'll be writing it up and sending it out for publication shortly.
It's such a cool idea for a research study. Sometimes I fantasize about doing a research study of some kind or another, and it's cool to get to look at that one.
I know this is a really fun one, and because there's not a lot of space for people operating in the underground to have a voice in the public or scientific or policy dialogue, because they have to kind of stay underground, concerns about legality and safety and all of that stuff. And so so much of the scientific and public dialogue will be informed by the clinical studies, right, like Compass Pathways is doing clinical studies for FDA approval. And those are really artificial. It's not like Johns Hopkins invented the right way to do mushrooms. Right. Like, we're using these protocols that were developed really to satisfy demands of the FDA drug approval process, right, but it's not necessarily like reflective of the best way to do mushrooms or the most safe way to do mushrooms or the most therapeutic way to do mushrooms. It's just like the way we kind of had to do it. But those are the protocols that are going to be sort of accepted as standard practice and accepted by policymakers and professional bodies. But that's really only because it's artificial. And it disregards the hundreds and thousands of years of history of other ways of, practicing with these substances. So how do we get those voices and practices into the scientific dialogue so that they could be part of the dialogue? Yeah. So that's what this study was inspired by.
Yeah, it's great. It's great work. And part of your methodology is a more in-depth interview, right?
Yeah, it's just a qualitative, in-depth interviews. I think we interviewed 16 practitioners just here in Colorado. I mean, it's quite possible you could expand it outside of Colorado and do hundreds of interviews. We certainly had a lot of people contacting us, wanting to do interviews, but just for the sake of feasibility for our research team to do this. We're like, no, let's keep this small and maybe get some funding and do it in a bigger way if it, feels useful.
Yeah. I guess it brings up, I don't know if a lot of questions, but one of them is, I wonder how common it is for the police, for law enforcement to kind of go after a guide like that. Do you have any sense of that? That is a risk.
Yeah, it is a risk. It's hard to know. I'm not sure if there's documented cases of that. None of the guides that we talked, a few of the 16 that we talked to said that, that was a concern for them, that they're, careful and they do screening and they encrypted messaging and all the kinds of things, but it really wasn't, the top concern for most of the people that we interviewed. They were more concerned about, they're more concerned about the what could happen with legalization or regulation, and like sort of how this gets commodified and co-opted by the sort of Western, medical therapeutic complex, and not having communities of practice. I think that was like the biggest thing, is like that I think actually was the biggest concern or risk cited, was the isolation, because you're at criminal risk, you're in this gray or, underground legal zone practicing, and you can't put yourself out there. You can't really, practice within a community of people who are holding each other accountable, and you have shared sense of ethics, and you have ways to, report abuses of whatever. So that isolation and not having communities of practice and learning communities was actually the biggest concern of most practitioners, more so than the criminal risk of being arrested for doing mushrooms. Yeah.
And I'm assuming or guessing that they mostly people find them through word of mouth, since they can't advertise.
It was largely word of mouth. Most of them said they don't even advertise. It was just, they all have a story. What was so interesting about it, all 16 people had a story about how they came to hear the call. That was one of the themes in our analysis, was hearing the call to guide. And every single person started with personal use that was profoundly impactful. Not necessarily easy or ecstatic by any means. Most of them had really complex relationships. It was like, had some really difficult experiences, and also profoundly important experiences. And then over time, they developed this personal relationship with the medicine. And then over time, they started hearing the call to guide. It was often very serendipitous, or a friend would ask them, "Hey, you've been doing this. I really trust you. Will you sit for me?" And then it just sort of, continued from there, and through like word of mouth. And some of them maybe even left their day jobs and said, "Okay, I guess I'm doing this full time now. I'm sitting or guiding or, working with people." And many of them had other types of like mentorship and training along the way, but not even half of the people in our sample were actually therapists with like training or degrees or licenses in therapy. But all of them had some kind of at least informal training and mentorship with guide work and psilocybin.
Interesting. Yeah. And you mentioned how like the famous John Hopkins study, for example, doesn't have to be like the gold standard of how psilocybin therapy, should it become legal, should be done. Did you find other, like, what other nuggets of wisdom can you share with us from the study of how it could be used or done? Or
Oh my gosh, there are so many. We asked guides about their essential practices and, what do they think is essential to practice? And the answers were just all over. There are so many different practices.
Really?
And and everybody came from, their own background. So some people were using like more traditional therapy modalities like CBT in their practice, and others were using nature-based practices, somatic practices, arts and movement, breath work. Like it was kind of ran the gamut, just based off of, what their, what they brought to it, like what they brought to the work. And there wasn't, it's surprising because some people do the laying down, eye shades, music. Some people guide with, they're in a nature and they're talking the whole time and they're relating and they're moving their bodies and they're doing things. So it was really, some people practice in a much more spiritual way where they're, they have crystals and doing all the energy work and everything. And others were much more, like I said, traditional, maybe doing like some cognitive behavioral therapy or NLP and like other. So it was really ran the gamut. It was interesting, just among those 16 people, how much variation there was and what they consider to be essential practices.
That's cool.
Which makes it hard to standardize. Like every single person was like, we asked, well, do you think this could be standardized? Could we have a protocol? Could we have like, this is how you do it? And they're like, every single person was like, I can't imagine how you would standardize, like how you could just develop a single protocol that is like, this is the way to do it. I think that's just not the nature of it.
Yeah, that's so interesting. It makes me imagine a future where, I mean, in the world of therapy, psychotherapy, coaching, healing today, there's so many different modalities, right? So many different systems, so many different ways people are doing that. And maybe with psychedelics, I imagine will be something similar, and people can kind of find what they think makes sense to them, what will work for them. And
Yeah,
maybe there'll be these big research studies that do develop protocols for specific diagnoses, like someone with, I don't know, bipolar or treatment-resistant depression or anxiety disorder, and they can, you know, that can be there too. Like there's room for it all, I think.
there's a room for a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, I think every practitioner in the study agreed that having some standards of ethics, like
Right.
there can be some standards developed to like prevent harm and uphold, some just ethical like minimums, like don't do this. This is harmful. Don't do that. That is an abuse of power. Like you never do that. And so I think that was sort of more the leaning of most practitioners to like have some agreed upon standards of preventing harm and upholding ethics, but having best practices around like how you actually hold space or encourage people to go within and like do it.
Yeah.
It seemed impossible. um
Hmm. Well, for
yeah.
sure, we need standards of ethics and we need accountability, and
Yeah.
legalization can help provide that. That'll be wonderful. And then I think another thing that I see a real need for is really clear, comprehensive guidelines of different medications and their interactions. And so people can make informed choices about how something like psilocybin would interact with whatever other medication they've been prescribed. And then we need really clear guidelines around physical, mental health issues that people have and how they may or may not work with certain medications, including psychedelics and certain treatments, right? Like really
Yeah.
expressive art therapy might not be, with psilocybin, might not be a great choice for someone who has, I don't know, a manic episode, right? Like that might not be a good combination. So
Yeah.
to have some guidelines around that would be good.
All of that research is really difficult to do. I mean, the practice goes so quickly beyond the state of knowledge or evidence according to the research. And the same is true with how we use psychiatric medications currently, right? Most medications are, we understand through a randomized controlled trial one medication's effects on this set of symptoms according to a checklist.
Mm,
But then, polypharmacy is kind of the norm, especially if you have diagnoses like bipolar disorder, bipolar, schizoaffective, or any of these diagnoses, that you are probably going to be on an antipsychotic and anticonvulsant or a stimulant and something else, and then something to help you sleep at night. And so you might be on 2, 3, or 4 different medications. We have no idea. No idea how those interact. We have no idea if those are like, I mean, any drug can be basically just prescribed for any psychiatric condition. Like they don't even, like the DSM diagnosis doesn't even match up
well,
to a particular medication anymore. Like if you have a diagnosis of ADHD or depression or bipolar, schizoaffective, you can basically be prescribed any of the medications, any of the classes, and any combination from those classes. And there's not like a one-to-one connection to the original diagnosis. And none of those combinations are studied, and especially in like special and vulnerable populations. So I don't know. I just, yes, those are all really good questions. And I don't have a lot of, I'm not super optimistic that we're going to have like scientific answers to all of those questions
wow.
before the practice is just already happening.
Yeah, that's really helpful for me to hear. And so after I graduated from graduate school, I worked in a place that was working with people with severe mental health issues like schizophrenia, like bipolar, schizoaffective disorder,
Yeah.
all this stuff. And in that organization, the people at the top of the pyramid, so to speak, were the doctors and the psychiatrists. And they would meet with all the clients and all the people living in this mental health home, and they would adjust their cocktail of drugs. And it was part of my job to give the medication out to people, make sure they took the right dosage of the right medications at the right time. And
Mm-hmm.
many of these people were taking, 8, 10, 12 different medications. And so it just feels good to hear that from you, that there's not clear science on this, and we're creating these cocktails. And I got to see firsthand the trial and error, and they would ask them, how are you doing? And they would make a little adjustment. How are you doing? A week later, 2 weeks later, and they kept trying to find whatever the perfect kind of balance of this cocktail. And it's
And it
wild.
becomes its own search where it's like, let's just find the right cocktail, the right, and just to like stabilize or to manage. And then like that's kind of the end goal, is just to find the right mix of drugs to keep this person like managed and not a troublemaker and not in like extreme acute distress.
Yeah.
But for a lot of the folks you're probably working with in that setting, there's really not a lot of hope beyond that.
Yeah.
For them.
It was
I
sad.
worked in those settings too.
Yeah, what you're saying is true, and it's sad. And a measure of success would be like, well, this person hasn't been hospitalized in 2 months. We're doing great. And it's like, really?
Is there anything more possible? Like, if that's the best that our like drug-based paradigm of care like has to offer, it's like, well, you haven't been to a hospital in 60 days, or like, well, you're managing to go to work. Like, if that's the best that paradigm of care has to offer, then I don't know. That doesn't leave me feeling very hopeful about what we're doing in those systems.
Yeah, no. Yeah, they need to change. We need improvements and new options for sure.
And there's plenty. I work a lot with folks with lived experience with psychiatric disorders, people who might call themselves psychiatric survivors if they've been harmed by the mental health system, or just ex-users who have rejected their diagnoses and went on to make different types of meaning of their experiences in extreme states. And I almost forgot where I was going with that. Oh, there's plenty of evidence. I mean, there's more emerging science, but also plenty of like user groups who have been applied labels like paranoid schizophrenia, chronic paranoid schizophrenia, and like these really severe diagnoses that seem like they're pretty hopeless, like they're like life sentences.
Mm-hmm.
But once they actually got out of the psychiatric system and got different kinds of help, of support, oftentimes through peers and others who have found different ways to make meaning of their lives, they can go on. I mean, they're just like these just brilliant, wonderful, like normal, like people who, yes, might have like a lot of trauma, or might have had some terrifying experiences, or might have been like locked up and acutely psychotic and like had these like breakdowns and breakthroughs or whatever. And yet it's not a life sentence. Like there's other ways that we can work with these extreme states that doesn't condemn people to a life sentence of just chronic polypharmacy and maybe just living on disability for the rest of their lives. Like that, it doesn't have to be the outcome.
That's really good to hear. Yeah. Hopefully that can give people some hope, because it can feel like a life sentence, and it can feel like you're stuck in a system. And part of that is you have to, all the medications you have to take and all the side effects. And
yeah. I mean, that's part of Bob Whitaker's book. So I'll just anybody who is interested in this conversation that we're having, just go back to Bob Whitaker's book, and he really leads you right through this drug-based paradigm of care and how at a population level it might actually be increasing chronicity, increasing severity, and keeping people on disability more than actually improving lives at a population level.
Yeah, such a big, important topic. And maybe I would love to have a future podcast episode or two that delves into that more. But at the very least, we can consider the fact that human beings lived on this earth for a long time without any of these medications. And we weren't, you know what I mean? Like people were managing okay. Maybe in some ways they were better off. So something to think about. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then your second study that you sent me was around MDMA and couples. Do you want to speak to that one? That was another really cool, interesting study.
Yeah, that was my partner. That was part of his dissertation research. And I was, just an author on that. Again, getting the voices of folks who are using psychoactive substances outside of like the conventional, like therapeutic, in a clinic or whatever, the ways that are sort of accepted, but really bringing recognition to the variety of ways that people are using substances, like healthfully, like with health and with like intention and with, like safe practices without being under the gaze of a therapist or a clinician or medical setting or clinical trial setting. Because part of this is like, I'm kind of an activist researcher, and at heart, I personally feel like we just have an inherent right to alter ourselves and an inherent right to use drugs. And so if that's an inherent right to that kind of cognitive liberty to explore our own consciousness, then there's a lot of implications for gatekeeping and who has like authority over our ability to, access substances that alter our consciousness. So again, with the MDMA study, we interviewed couples who are using MDMA recreationally, just on their own, in their own homes, as part of just their relationship. And so there's been other studies. There's lots of studies about like the rave scene and using MDMA, among like the party scene and the rave scene, or couples using MDMA with other friends out at parties and things like that. But there wasn't any research on couples using MDMA like privately, just the two of not going out to party, not going to a rave, but just like privately at home. And you can imagine it's a more difficult to access population. Like who's doing that? Like, I don't know. Like, how do you find those people? So we found a few and interviewed them, and just again learned about like, what are you doing this for? Like, how did you come into this? Like, what do you think are the benefits? Like, what does that look like when you do it at home? Are you concerned about like the risks? Like, what if something were to happen? What would you do? And so that's what that study was about. Just illuminating this other aspect of use, and that's just like adults just using it in ways that are actually really, thoughtful and high functioning, and, producing some pretty quality experiences for the relationship.
Yeah, I love that. It's so cool. It's like, adults making mature decisions, using it in a responsible way. And part of the interesting thing in the study was, I'm just looking at it now, there were 4 kind of categories of how MDMA can be used. Psychotherapeutic, medical, right? The research we're talking about. And then what was called deviant recreational, like a party setting. And then psychospiritual. And then the 4th one is what you're speaking to, right? Cognitive relational, like support a relationship. Well-being.
Yeah, the cognitive relational was like kind of what emerged out of the interviews. It's like, well, it kind of had elements of these different models of use, and like couples were borrowing from the different types of use in these different like ways, but it kind of was its own thing. And it was, just really based around like, how do we set ourselves up for success, to maximize the potential for positive outcomes in this, the purpose with the purpose in mind of like enhancing our like relational connection.
Love that.
Both like, if one of the partners was going through something, it could have been, for their own connection with themselves or things going on in their lives, but then also with each other, or like holding space for each other to like really like look at maybe some difficult issues that had come up in their relationship, or to enhance their communication or whatever. But it was it was very deliberate, intentional, and when we asked, we would ask like, okay, so what are your concerns and what are the risks? And what do you think? What if something bad happened? They would almost, the participants would almost like chuckle, like, well, what do you mean it was something bad? Like, what would happen? Where like, there's no way we would call the police, but like, they couldn't even imagine a scenario where like something terrible would happen, where they would need like medical intervention or be taken to the hospital. And they're
That's
like,
significant,
no.
Right? That's interesting.
Like they couldn't even think of a scenario where that would like be a problem. And so it was interesting, not that there's no risk or anything, but just like in the context that they were using it in, and with that sort of they found their own information. There was no gatekeeper. They didn't have to go to a doctor and explain why they wanted to use it. They just, got it illegally, obviously, and, got their own information and used it in ways that were really beneficial or have been really beneficial to them, with no gatekeeper, no intermediary having to like do that work for them or tell them how it should be used.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a cool idea for a study, and it's cool to like highlight that that's, a possibility and a reality. And I wonder, I mean, statistically speaking, it's probably more dangerous to drive across town on the freeway than to be in your own home, assuming it's like not spiked with poison or something.
No, true. Actually, one of the participants in that study said something like, I eat crap out of the microwave. I eat microwave dinners. That's probably more toxic to my body than like MDMA 3 times a year.
Right. Well, and on that note, another interesting thing in the study is the people doing this, like it seemed like it was helping motivate them to be healthier in general, eat healthier, exercise more. And I've noticed that with psychedelic users in general, it can have that effect of like being more aware of what you're putting in your body, the effects it have of exercise, of breathing, of meditation, of
yeah, really. And most couples put a lot of preparation into it. So that might be days or the full week or two before they had like a planned date night or whatever, it was going to be, where they were like, cut down on their alcohol consumption, and they were, eating healthy and light for the few days before they were going to use it. And, they had recovery plans for the day or two after, where they were really taking care of themselves and making sure they got extra sleep, that kind of thing. Which again, and nobody told them to do that. They just discovered that was the best way to use it for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that could be one of the great values of this kind of thing, of like the innate healing of our own body, of our own system, of our own mind, like that we know we need the right amount of sleep. We know what foods are good for us. We don't really need someone else to tell us that at this point. I mean, we need good information, but
yeah. Oh, sorry. Can I say something else about that? Just real quick, I want to know that I think the implications of this, it was a very small study. It was just like, putting something out into the dialogue. But the Beckley Foundation they did release a really large, like 150-page report, and it's called a roadmap to regulating MDMA. And it discusses, what do we really know about the benefits and risks of MDMA, and what is the roadmap to regulating this substance, and should it necessarily just be medicalized, for PTSD available by a doctor? Does the evidence around MDMA, support and justify that? And I really appreciate where they landed was with this just informed adult use model. And they're like the regulatory roadmap from them starts with decriminalization first, just like a foundation of decriminalization, and then adds like a safe supply. And so you don't need a prescriber, you don't need a recommendation from a doctor, you don't need anything. But in order to ensure a safe supply, you go buy it from a pharmacy just over the counter. And you don't have to like have anybody's permission. You just go to the pharmacy, you sign off that you received educational materials that on the safe enough use of this substance, and then you can use it.
Wow.
And then there's like the regular adult control, all the user controls, like, only if you're over 18 and like whatever, all the normal things that we're used to. But it's really about like removing criminal penalties and ensuring a safe supply. And that's it. And then let people use it.
People make their own choices, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And I thought it was a really interesting model. They also said, maybe you would want to have some adult spaces for use that are like alcohol free, but like MDMA lounges or something like that, which I think is an excellent idea. I don't know how ready we are for that in the United States. But
I have to go to Amsterdam for that or something.
Yeah. But I just really like the idea of like, what's the simplest way that we can open up access to these different substances that really are quite safe and that people can use with just a little information, or maybe there's just a little extra support, but without having like layers and layers of like complicated regulation and gatekeeping authority. how do we make it simple and ensure a safe supply and give people the information they need?
Yeah. That makes so much sense to me. I'm a big fan of that book, Drug Use for Grown-Ups. Are you familiar with that? Is it
Oh yeah,
Carl
yeah.
Harris? Yeah,
Carl Hart, yeah.
Carl. And so just the idea of making all these substances legal, but like ensuring the quality. And, it just seems like a better model than making them illegal. And if you don't want to use them, that's 100% fine, right? Like, obviously. And so if your value system, you don't want to, and that was an interesting part of that study. You asked people, do you feel like your life would be better if you had never used, mind altering substances like this? That was an interesting question to ask someone.
Yeah. Did you ever wish you didn't use drugs or something like that?
Something like that, yeah.
I don't think anybody was a yes on that. They're like, no, this has like enriched my life incredibly. I'm so thankful.
Yeah, but I'm for sure there'll be people who don't want to make that choice, and I respect them too, so.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know. I think there's like this fear of like, well, if you make heroin available legally, then everyone's going to start using heroin.
It's just not true. It's ridiculous.
And it's just not, I don't think that's.
Most people won't want to do that. Yeah.
No. I don't think there's any evidence to support that in countries that have opened up access to different substances. I don't think there's any evidence that there's just a flood of people now wanting to, use heroin and whatever becomes legalized or decriminalized. It just doesn't, it's just not.
It makes me think about something else in terms of the simplicity of what you just described, where you could go to a pharmacy and you could just, sign your name and receive it. I would, if it was up to me, which it's not obviously, but I would add something around like not being able to advertise this stuff, because it's the advertising and the selling, like we were talking about earlier, that could, I just don't think it's necessary. Instead of advertising, we should just have education. Like, here's the information, make your choice for yourself, not take this and it'll fix you forever or whatever it is.
Yeah, I think the advertising, I kind of agree with you on the advertising. And, the US and New Zealand are the only two countries in the world that allow direct to consumer advertising of prescription drugs.
Wow. I didn't know that.
Mm-hmm.
That should be totally legal. I hate the advertising of prescription drugs.
And, drug companies, that's only one of the many, many ways that they promote drugs, but it's sort of, that you remember the old Zoloft commercials or something of like the little chemical imbalance bubbles or whatever. Well, the chemical imbalance theory of depression was like a myth. It was debunked, like decades ago. There's no scientific validity to this idea that like low serotonin or too much or too little serotonin causes depression. And yet the little commercials like, well, your depression might be related to this imbalance of serotonin. That's why you ask your doctor for Zoloft.
Yeah.
That's had some really significant implications and just our relationships with drugs and our relationships with our own distress.
Yeah.
Why do you think the US is like one of two countries in the world that allows that to happen? It's because the pharmaceutical lobby is right there up with like the oil and gas lobby and like some of the the biggest lobbying groups at the federal level who pour a lot of money into influencing legislation, including making sure that they can advertise directly to consumers.
Oh, yeah, it's disgusting. To go back to my experience working in the mental health home with severe mental health issues, these I don't know what even to call them, representatives of various pharmaceutical companies would show up pretty consistently, honestly, and they would take some of the doctors out to lunch and nurses, and they would bring these gift bags, and there would be some new psychiatric medication, some new SSRI or whatever it was, and they'd be like, try this out and come out to lunch and we'll tell you about it, and here's a gift bag. And they wouldn't give me a gift bag because I couldn't prescribe it. So I was like, I felt like a second-class citizen there, but it was not, I hated that. I just thought it was, and a lot of the doctors hated it too, and they would refuse to go out to the lunch or dinner or whatever, but that was happening. Yeah. They would come by.
Yeah, no, absolutely. They've cracked down a lot on that practice. A lot of clinics more and more have policies against it, against the gifts and the lunch and all of that kind of stuff. But they still, free samples is one of the biggest ways that drug companies promote their drugs is free samples. Ridiculous. It makes sense. It's the same on the underground market, right? Like, get someone here, try a free sample, you're gonna love it. But Uh, but they've cracked down a lot on that. But they did show there's been research on the gift giving, and it's actually showed that like smaller gifts are more influential in prescribing practices because they're sort of like if you accept like a trip to Hawaii, you know that you're kind of on the take and you're like more vigilant, you're like, oh, well, I'm not going to be persuaded. I'm going to accept this, vacation to Hawaii or whatever, but they're not buying me. But it's the small gifts under $20 that create that culture of like goodwill between a company and like prescribers that are actually research has shown have been more influential in getting prescribers to, switch brands or prescribe their medicines because you think it's not on your radar. You don't feel like you're being bought.
Right.
And it's just more, it's a subtle form of manipulation, but it was highly effective.
Yeah. What a weird, crazy world we have.
Yeah, definitely.
Any other studies coming up that you're working on?
Oh, goodness. Well, after we get the underground psilocybin practitioner study published, we'll have that out in the next couple of months. It's going to go back to the community and see what's next. I mean, that's kind of just kind of how I like to do it. Just go back to the community and be like, okay, here's what we found. Do we want to take this further? What would be the next question? Maybe we turn these findings into a larger scale survey and get, more practitioner voices involved. I'm not sure where it's going to go. I just kind of one step at a time. And then I'm working on a book. I'm second author on a book for social workers on psychiatric medications, infusing kind of a more critical perspective into social work education on psychopharmacology. And so that's kind of a big project in front of me right now.
That's interesting. I mean, so as a social worker, they don't have the ability to prescribe medications. Is that correct?
Correct. No, we do not prescribe. So it's more roles of education, counseling, advocacy, medication monitoring is probably one of the biggest roles for social workers that I'm really pushing to get social workers to take up more and more. I've done trainings in like child welfare settings with social workers. Foster kids are disproportionately like medicated and medicated with like antipsychotics and stuff more so than kids in the general population. So really working with social workers in those kinds of settings, juvenile justice and child welfare and whatever, to take on the role of medication monitoring and really tracking the effects of meds on kiddos and trying to prevent harms and being a voice of advocacy. Because, 15-minute medication visits, you're not going to catch a lot, but social workers tend to spend more time with kids and families and in school settings and, see them in different environments. And so there's a lot of information social workers can convey and document if they know what they're looking for, if they know the signs of like behavioral toxicity of a child on a stimulant. And so I think social workers have a major role to play, and they just need to know what to do, what to look for, and have a little bit of confidence to be an advocate in systems and agencies where your medical prescribers tend to have a little bit more authority and say. And so it can be hard to be taken seriously in those environments when you're like, wait, what do you know about this? This is my domain.
Right. Yeah, I really appreciate you advocating for that and taking on these big issues around psychedelics and then around psychiatric medications. They're fairly taboo topics that a lot of people are afraid to touch or criticize if you don't have the MD next to your name. And maybe we could change that culture a little bit because we're all human and we're all being affected by them. And we should all be understanding what we're putting in our body and how it affects us. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah. It just seems like such an important issue. I wonder if
it is. That's what I've
connected
kind of dedicated my career to.
Okay. Have you connected with many doctors or psychiatrists who are willing to criticize the status quo?
There's a few. But and yeah, I mean, there's some big names within the profession, right? Like Alan Francis is a big, well-known psychiatrist who was, leading up one of the revisions of the DSM, and then after that, sort of flipped positions and was like calling out overdiagnosis and just like all the like, whoa, this is too much. We need to like get honest here with like what we're really doing. So there's been some like, big name psychiatrists in the field, prominent, who have, flipped positions and turned into critics of their own profession. Locally, I think there's, a couple of MD psychiatrists I know who are at least sensitive to the critiques of their own profession and try to do better. But it's you spend all that time in medical school, and there's a lot of buy-in to the paradigm, and then there's also ego. I mean, it's just a reality. But I don't know. I bring the same level of critique to the social work profession. I mean, students in my first year class are like, wait, what are we even doing here if we're just going to like tear apart our own profession? And I'm like, yes, that's what we're doing here. We should tear apart our own profession so that we can be reinventing it and making it better and actually disrupting the things that aren't working and doing better. I think that's an obligation we have to our profession.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. You want to critique it, make sure that it's doing what it's supposed to be doing, right?
Yeah. Don't take it. It's not personal. It's it's just needs to happen.
Yeah. I guess the bigger perspective there is humans, we like to know, steps 1, 2, 3, 4, and we'll do this and we'll just follow down this road. And it's worth stepping back and questioning that. Like, is this protocol helping? Like, what is the bigger system we're a part of? And
yeah, that kind of like zoom in and zoom out. Like, what is this that I'm being trained to do connected to on a larger level? Like, what am I perpetuating? What am I disrupting? Is there like an ethical principle that's underlying this practice? And does that align with my own ethical principles? And like, I think that is what just like critical self-reflexivity and it just requires of us if we're willing to go there and be changed. Yeah.
Well, it's been great talking to you. Thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been a fun conversation. I hope it's interesting to other people too.
I think it will be. And I'll link the NOAC Society below. And any last words or thoughts for us?
No, I just, appreciate the time and, encourage everyone to, just think that, we're in relationship to all things, and relationship to our own, inner self, our relationship to the drugs we use. And it doesn't matter if it's, Lexapro or if it's LSD, there's just a relationship there. And so I think that's ultimately, just put them all back in the pot and stir it together and like figure out what feels like a real authentic sense of relationship with any of these substances. That's what I would leave folks with.
Nice. All right. Well, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to another episode of A State of Mind podcast. I work here in Boulder, Colorado as a therapist, coach, and meditation teacher. You can learn more about that at my website, astateofmindcounseling.org. And you can learn more about the podcast at astateofmindpodcast.com. Any donation is greatly appreciated. You can support the show directly at patreon.com/astateofmind. Thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you here next time.